Chapter 10 The Fantasy at Kinsna. One afternoon, as I sat at my desk in my office on the Strand, two English gentlemen in top hats entered. Although I had never seen them before, their easy and familiar "Good afternoon, Captain Dean," their open manner, and their frank, good-humored faces threw me completely off my guard. They were not only well dressed, they had a perfect Oxford accent, and although I should have realized that my efforts in behalf of the kid had thrown me in the wrong light with the English, and that it was important to be careful, I had no idea that these English gentlemen were on anything but legitimate business. It would have taken a wiser man than I to have foreseen the coming weeks. Within a few moments they had explained the situation. These two, with several of their friends, all young bloods just out from England, had seen all they cared to of the Boer War, and thought a little hunting and adventuring along the coast would suit their fancy. They had seen the Pedro Gorino where she lay in the harbor, and they had been impressed with her fine lines and rigging. They had set their hearts upon that ship, and had come to me to procure her for the hunt. My business at this time was a profitable one, and I was not altogether willing to accept a charter from these young gentlemen. When they asked me how much I would charge for 60 days, I replied more to cool their ardor than for any other reason. Oh, £600 sterling. The figure did not seem to faze them. The older of the two took £300 in notes from a roll in his pocket and passed them across the desk, saying he would pay the rest when the trip was under way. I offered to make out a receipt, but he declined with a wave of his hand. He did not even think it necessary to put our agreement on paper. My word as a gentleman satisfied him completely. Strangely enough, it seemed to me, these men wanted no crew, a bare boat charter. They intended to sail the Pedro Gorino and do the work of sailors for the sheer sport of it. They invited me to accompany them as a guest, and I was glad to accept their invitation, for my ship was close to my heart, and I should have hated to see it sailing out of Table Bay with no one but strangers aboard. When I told the crew of my new charter, they made ready to leave the boat somewhat sorrowfully. Sidney Wilson in particular mumbled vituperations, and wished woe to all Englishmen on land or on sea. He took great pride in the cleanliness and orderly arrangement of his galley, and it broke his heart to imagine a stranger desecrating his holy of holies. "Ain't no buck of a man goin' cook like Sidney, skipper," he pleaded. "I know it, Sidney, but an agreement is an agreement," I replied. He was not to be easily convinced. He explained that he knew every pan in the galley. Had he not served faithfully for months, how could an Englishman cook such stews and roasts as the ones he cooked? He saw at last that he would have to yield, however, and joined the group on the deck who were preparing to go ashore. The whole crew looked so disconsolate and dejected that I decided to cheer them up. I told them that they would be paid for the next 60 days exactly as if they were aboard the ship, and that when the Pedro Gorino returned from her trip, they might have their old jobs again. At this their countenances brightened, and they went ashore happy. Early next morning the 9 sporting Englishmen came aboard. They had weapons of all kinds, fishing tackle, leather bags, and trunks filled with their wardrobes, and a great array of nautical equipment. The man who had paid me the £300 on the previous day had a set of 18 guns with dull blue barrels and hand-carved monogrammed stocks, ranging in bore from a 22 to a 16-pound .6, fully capable of stopping a bull elephant. He also had a display of Admiralty charts from His Majesty's stationer, such as I have never seen in all my sea-going days. Among their equipment were sextants and compasses, binoculars and telescopes, as well as several complicated instruments, which were quite new to me. Contrary to my forebodings, they were fine sailors. They were all dressed in immaculate white duck, and they went about their business with the air of men who know the sea. They could clamber up the ratlines to furl a sail with as much ease as any of my colored boys, meanwhile carrying on a sophisticated and witty conversation. It was the warm season of the year, and we had fine weather. They had planned to make Kinsna their first stop, but instead of plotting a course straight for their destination, they sailed the boat capriciously, tacking in and out of the wind for the mere sport of it. The Pedro Gorino, much to my satisfaction, performed in splendid fashion. When we had been at sea a day or two, however, they began to take less interest in sailing, and began playing cards and drinking champagne, as young Englishmen will. The servant they had brought along as cook, steward, and valet was kept busy bringing ice and bottles. They began keeping their watches less regularly, and watching their charts less closely. I hesitated to interfere, but I was greatly relieved when on the 5th evening out of Cape Town we sighted the heads which guard the entrance to the inner harbor at Kinsna. Kinsna itself is some 3 miles from the sea on a perfectly protected estuary, fed by the Kinsna River. The depth of water on the bar was easily sufficient to admit the Pedro Gorino, and I suggested sailing her into the harbor so that we might be protected from any sudden storm that might arise. It seemed to me that the Englishmen resented my suggestion, and more to assert themselves than because of the fast-falling darkness, they dropped anchor a mile from the heads in the almost unprotected sea. The night was so warm that we slung our hammocks on the deck to catch whatever breeze might be stirring. When I rolled in at midnight, the Englishmen were still drinking and playing cards. The sky was cloudy, and there seemed little danger of a high wind. As I fell to sleep, I had no premonition that this evening was to be one of the most eventful of my life. It may have been an hour, although it seemed no such length of time, when I felt myself hurtling bodily through the air. When I fully awoke, I was plunging through cold water all entangled in my hammock. In that brief moment, 1,000 things rushed through my brain. I realized that I was overboard, but how or why I did not know. I realized that I must be near the ship, but the absolute blackness of sea and sky prevented me from seeing anything at all. I called loudly to let the men aboard know that I was in the sea. There was no answer out of the darkness. The ocean was as silent and as smooth as a pool. Its quiet soothed my nerves and cleared my brain. If one should swim in ever-increasing circles, I reasoned, one could eventually locate any object, provided the object was not moving. I began circling around and around and around, thinking on each turn, surely this time. But after a half-hour's fruitless search, I had to admit defeat. Deep within me I knew that she was within a few hundred yards, but somehow I had missed her. I had been a fine swimmer in my earlier days, able to swim as much as 6 miles in the surf, so I had no fear on that score. But the terrible silence, the way the ship had vanished, and the mystery surrounding my plunge overboard froze the blood in my veins. The sharks were an additional cause for apprehension. On other trips through these waters, I had watched them sport fearlessly about the ship, and I knew how deadly they were. For a time I continued to swim and call, but finally, seeing how futile it was, I decided to strike out for shore. The pitch-black sky precluded any possibility of learning my direction from the heavens. My swimming in circles had entirely puzzled the intuitive sense usually with the mariner. I knew that the shore was less than a mile away, yet I had no way of knowing in which direction. I merely took a chance and struck out. I have no idea how long I swam. My arms pulled me forward with monotonous strokes. For ever so long I did not tire, but as I swam farther and farther, perhaps a mile, 2 miles, 3 miles, perhaps an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, the sickening thought occurred again and again, perhaps I am swimming out to sea. And then, as if all the heavens and seas were plotting against me, I would think, perhaps the shore is but a dozen strokes away. I do not know when I tired. I had lost all sense of time and space. I only know that when I could swim no more, I began to tread water and float by turns. I began to call again, but my voice was so weak and faint on the measureless ocean that I soon ceased. I thought of the great depth beneath me, and the other men asleep on the sea floor, and I remembered a song from Shakespeare I had learned as a child. Full fathom 5 thy father lies, of his bones are coral made, those are pearls that were his eyes, nothing of him that doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange. The words were infinitely soothing. I became very drowsy and lost consciousness. When I awoke, I was lying on a sand beach where I had been washed. I have no idea in what manner. The shallow water lay about me to my waist, but my head and shoulders were on the sand in the bright sunlight. In my first amazement, I could remember nothing that had gone before. I did not care to move, but lay like driftwood, tossed upon the beach after a storm. I thought that I must be dreaming, for the seagulls wheeled and fell about me without fright. Or perhaps I was dead and drowned. The thought filled me with a great sadness. Slowly the events of the previous evening came back to me. I was aware of a dull throbbing in my head, as if I had been severely beaten. I could hear and see in a dreamy sort of way, but none of my muscles would move at my command. My legs seemed rigid and frozen, and my arms lay stiffly at my side. I attempted to rise out of the water, but my body refused to move. I tried to shout, but no sound came from my lips. Perhaps it was minutes, or perhaps hours, when far off down the beach I saw two figures approaching. As they came nearer, I could make out nets upon their shoulders, and knew that they were Africanado fishermen trudging homeward. Their brown bodies glistened in the sunlight. I tried desperately to call, but the faint sound of my voice could hardly have been heard 5 yards away. Luckily, they saw me in passing and dropped their nets, hurried to my side. They took me on their strong shoulders and carried me to their little village. I was taken to a native hut and laid upon a bed made of a cow hide, stretched between two poles. An Africanado girl fed me the broth of herbs and hot teas. Through my dreamy senses she seemed some dusky goddess. She came and went with quiet footsteps, and often laid her hand upon my hot forehead. Her skin was the color of guinea gold, and her breast hung in her scant dress like two golden apples. When she spoke, her words were like music. These people were less real than any I had ever known, the men so strong, the women so comely. I had many hours to think and to wonder while I was recovering. If this was not all fantasy, there were things hard to explain. Why had the Englishmen thrown me overboard? They might have been drunk, but even so, what could have led them to such an act? How had it happened I could not find the ship? There had scarcely been a breath of air over the ocean, surely not enough to move the ship. How had I escaped the sharks in the bay? And above all, how had it happened that, having fallen unconscious, I had not drowned, but had somehow reached the beach? The currents along those shores are such that the undertow would carry one toward rather than away from the land. Yet if I had been swimming out to sea, hour after hour, I must have reached a point miles from shore before I at last lost consciousness. There was of course the possibility that I had been swimming in a circle and had at last approached the beach. No, it was easier to doubt the whole affair. It was all a dream from which I would awake, safe aboard my ship. The Africanados rubbed my body with oil. It was very soothing and seemed to help me regain my strength. My speech returned slowly, and with it a limited use of my arms and legs. One day, perhaps a week, after I had been carried to the hut, I tried to rise to my feet. For a moment I stood dizzy and reeling by the side of my bed, then fell backward in a faint. Minutes seemed hours, hours days. It seemed as if the whole summer had passed before I was at last able to move my tired body out to the sunshine of the beach. I had been a strong and able seaman when I had left Cape Town. Now I was more like an image of death than a living human being. My body was emaciated and bent. My beard, never heavy, was yet sufficiently grown to change the looks of my face until an old friend would hardly have recognized me. As soon as it was humanly possible, I prepared to leave for Kinsna, some 5 miles from the fishing village. I had only my pajama trousers, no other clothes of any kind, but clothes matter little in that part of the world, and I started off afoot with 2 of the Africanados, anxious to learn the truth and recover my ship, if it were not already too late. I did not forget to thank the kind people, particularly the girl who had nursed me to health. When I arrived at Kinsna, I commenced inquiring about the Pedro Gorino. No one had seen her. At last I found a man who said that some weeks before he had seen a sailing vessel anchored a mile off the Heads that might answer to my description of the Pedro Gorino, but she had dropped anchor late one afternoon and had been gone by morning. To add to my perplexity, not one of my old friends at Kinsna recognized me. I went to the dock and the offices of ship's agents, but everywhere I was taken for some old beachcomber or beggar. One and all discredited my story. I began to remember stories of men who had come back to earth in other forms. I felt confused, bewildered, and lost. Was I really so different from what I had been? Not the least fantastic of this strange sequence of events was the time involved. The Pedro Gorino had dropped anchor off the Heads on the evening of January 5th. When I reached Kinsna, after my convalescence, it was January 20th. I could hardly believe the calendar. What had seemed a whole season was but half a month of summer. I decided to determine my sanity, borrowing enough money from the friendly Africanados to wire Cape Town. I sent a message to Peter Benjamin concerning the Pedro Gorino. His return wire stated that she was riding at anchor in Table Bay, and had been for the last 10 days. I no longer could distinguish the real from the unreal, nor the truth from the fabric and weave of my fevered mind. My waking hours were filled with dreams, and at night my dreams echoed my waking hours. One morning, however, I took new hope. A ship belonging to Thesson and Company had just dropped anchor in the estuary. I went aboard, half hoping and half fearing to meet someone I knew. As luck would have it, the second mate was one of the men who had come aboard the Pedro Gorino when she had first dropped anchor in Table Bay some months before. He looked at me without a gleam of recognition in his eyes. "Surely you remember me, Johnson," I said. At the sound of my voice, his face brightened. "You're Captain Dean of the Pedro Gorino." The ship was bound for Delagoa Bay and was not due to return to Cape Town for some months, so it was impossible for me to take passage aboard her. The officers, however, were a fine sort, and lent me £50. With this I paid my friends, the Africanados, for their kindness, bought myself clothes, and started by Cape Cart on my journey to Cape Town. Because I was still weak, I took the trip by easy stages. When I arrived at Cape Town, my friends listened to my story in amazement. They had seen nothing of the 9 Englishmen. Most of them did not even know that the boat had left the harbor, for although I had been gone for over a month, during the last 3 weeks of that time the Pedro Gorino had lain in Table Bay. My crew went back aboard the ship, and trade went on as usual, but for months I carried on an investigation, attempting to discover my malefactors. I went to all the authorities, but none could or would help me. All that ever came of the affair was a short, semi-humorous article in one of the local papers that took it all as the fabrication of an old salt which might entertain their not too serious readers. Chapter 11. Lorenco Marcus for a Song. When I was introduced to Senor da Costa, I was only aware that I had met a small, sharp-eyed Portuguese merchant, not at all conscious of the fact that through his subsequent action I might find myself on the verge of making history. Da Costa had come to Cape Town to purchase freight for Delagoa Bay. When I met him, he had gathered together several hundred tons. He could have easily chartered a ship large enough to transport all his purchases. Instead, although I could carry less than half of his freight, he offered me a full cargo and 30 native passengers at a handsome figure. I accepted the charter and ordered Benjamin to prepare to receive the freight and passengers. In due course of time, I gave the command to up anchor, and we made our departure for Delagoa Bay. As we left Cape Town, we noticed over Table Mountain a tablecloth, a cloud perhaps a half-mile in diameter. As every mariner in those waters will tell you, it is a sign indicative of uncertain weather. As I had expected, the sea was rough, and I had to plot a wide course to miss Cape Agulhas. We could only use topsails and the fore staysail during the first 2 days, as the headwinds made us run on our starboard beam. Off the coast of Natal, the weather moderated. From here on, the sailing was beautiful. Fortunately, every one aboard was inured to the sea, and since there were no women or children, we had no sickness. The gull-like qualities of the Pedro Gorino seemed very apparent to me on this trip, and I was very proud of my boat. Much as I like her performance, however, I began to see that within the next year or so I would have to install power. I had put it off time and again for sentimental reasons. I had been aboard sailing vessels all my life, and I liked the excitement aroused in the fight with wind and weather. It seemed a little sacrilegious and immoral to cheat the ship out of her heritage, but I was convinced that it must be done. Thesson and Company had shown me correspondence from a Rotterdam shipbuilding concern that led me to believe that sufficient progress had been made to revolutionize maritime activities to the extent of making strictly sail obsolete. My exchequer at this time would easily have permitted the change, and I was determined to purchase and install a modern power plant in the very next slack season. A day or two before we had made our departure, Senor da Costa had taken the British mail steamer for Delagoa Bay. His business was pressing, and he could scarcely have afforded the slower passage on the Pedro Gorino. At last, with no untoward experience, except a little rough weather, and the ordinary humdrum of a voyage on a tropical sea. We sighted Delagoa Bay. Benjamin knew this harbor well and wanted to pilot us into the fairway, but I thought discretion the better part of valor, and dropping anchor outside the reefs, signaled for a pilot. We were soon in the spacious bay, in front of a little city of perhaps 5,000 inhabitants, a port with all the earmarks of a Portuguese town. Lourenço Marques had grown and changed wonderfully since I had seen it as a boy. Years before, I found it to be a real African tropical town, and although the majority of the inhabitants were Portuguese or of Portuguese descent, there were also Parsees, Parisians, Gypsies, Arabs, Indians, Madagascans, Somalis, English, Bears, Chinese, Japanese, and a motley crew of mixed mulattoes. At the invitation of Senor del Costa, I came ashore as his guest, and remained with him during my whole stay at Delagoa Bay, leaving the boat in charge of Benjamin. I gave him the responsibility of lightering the freight ashore and releasing the passengers. I realized that there was something unusual in the air, and I wanted to be able to apply all my time and energy on the problem when its nature became apparent. The first sure sign that I had was the attitude of the authorities toward me. Senor da Costa was a close friend of the governor, yet this in itself was not sufficient to account for the deference with which the whole staff of government officials treated me. I pretended to enjoy the affairs to which I was invited, and I accepted the hospitality offered me as nonchalantly as possible, but the fact remained that I was apprehensive. My host did his utmost to impress me with the town. He pointed out its fine plaza, where business was transacted. He extolled the extreme gentleness of the people, who, despite the fact they were a mixed populace, stood in need of very little law enforcement. He showed me how well the various groups mixed in their social and commercial life, for, with the exception of the Bears and the English whose political sympathies at this time made them stand aloof, the inhabitants were friendly and congenial. Above all, he wanted me to understand the great future ahead of the town as capital, or at least the seat of the colonial officials who ruled Portuguese East Africa. Its position was important and unique. It was like a game with a sixth sense. I perceived an ulterior motive, yet I was quite unable to decipher the meaning of the moves da Costa was making. One of my idiosyncrasies when I have a problem is to walk in the open air while I am trying to solve it. I went everywhere in the little city, and was soon acquainted with most of its streets, but I grew to know something more than its physical nature. I had had enough experience with men to analyze predominant emotion when I felt it in the air. I had been in towns where without a word of actual warning I could sense revolution. Here it was something even more terrible than revolt. It was the feeling of fear. People were glancing nervously toward the bay or back toward the jungle. They talked together, and there was fear in their voices. Stupidly enough, I was unable to fathom the cause or meaning of their fright, until one afternoon. Almost by accident, it would seem, I met the secretary to the Governor-General. As we sat at our little table in the shade of two great trees, sipping wine, we talked carelessly, it would appear, yet each to his own purpose. We had lived in the United States for some years. We talked of Philadelphia, Washington, Boston, and New York. Slowly and very naturally, the conversation shifted to the colored race in America. He pointed out facts of which I was already painfully aware, particularly that America was no place for the colored race, that as long as the African stayed in that environment, he was ruining himself for the more important things in life. He was lessening his own chances of ever gaining social prestige or political independence, and he was encountering a climate and a culture devastating to his morals and his intellect. To all this I readily agreed, wondering, meanwhile, why this Portuguese government official should suddenly become so eloquent upon a problem that, while it concerned me more deeply than any other problem in the world, had no reason whatsoever for concerning him. I had always been convinced that the Ethiopian must return to Africa if his race was ever to reach world prominence, but whether or not the secretary to the governor was aware of my sympathies, he spent a whole hour trying to convince me of my own hypothesis. Then he switched, rather abruptly, to the beauties of Delagoa Bay, and the great unexploited wealth that lay in the thousands of square miles, including in Portuguese East Africa. He grew almost oratorical in his praise of the fine port, the plaza, the prosperity of the province, Lourenço Marques, with its view of sea and forest. Finally he came to the point, leaning more closely than he had hitherto leaned. He almost whispered in my ear, "I suppose you realize that your position in Africa is as insecure as it is unique." I was genuinely puzzled. "Yes," he continued, "we realize that America has one very subtle and powerful influence that no other country can boast. But as long as her agents have no real foothold, they are no more secure than the agents of any other country. The penalty for spies is death." I asked him to explain himself, and he, thinking that I too was playing the game, complied. "Of course you understand that we have been watching your movements up and down the coast, your stops at Pont d'Hollande, East London, and Port Elizabeth. Your search is ended. I offer you the opportunity for which you have been seeking, and I offer it in a way that will make your act seem wholly lawful." I tried to cover my amazement. "Just what is my reputed position in Africa?" I asked, "and what have I been attempting outside of my lawful business in the coast trade?" "Everyone knows," he told me, "that you are an intelligence officer in the employ of the American government, and one of the most dangerous sort, since your power over the native is tremendously increased because of your color. As for the immediate object for which you are striving, that too is well known. You have been seeking an opening for your government, any tiny port or town." "I deny every word of it," I said hotly. "Perhaps You represent another power, another country, another faction, or let us say an organization of your own people." He shrugged his shoulders. "The situation remains primarily the same." I saw clearly now, and my reply was evasive, as I knew it must be. His voice dropped to a whisper. "I am offering you the vast territory of Portuguese East Africa, including the city of Lourenço Marques, for the ridiculously low figure of £50,000 sterling. The possibilities opened before me like a flower. Delagoa Bay, future maritime headquarters for native Africa; Lourenço Marques, a new center of culture for the colored race; Portuguese East Africa, a national home to which the wandering Ethiopians the world over might come and live in peace. Who could tell? With such a foothold, an enterprising colony might expand until it had recaptured the whole continent. "Give me 6 months," I said. He was running his slender hands nervously through his long black hair. Impossible. Why anything might happen in 6 months. What might happen within 6 months? Anything, he said, but I knew that I had hit at the root of the matter, and I determined to investigate a theory of my own the minute that I reached Cape Town. Chapter 12. I learn intrigue at a bitter school. The next morning, I wrote a dozen letters to people of my own race, friends in America and in Europe. I outlined the proposed purchase as glamorously as possible, trying to arouse in others some of the enthusiasm which I myself felt. My plea was for financial and moral support, and I asked my friends to answer immediately, and to direct their letters to Cape Town. Fortunately, a British mail steamer was in the harbor, and by evening my epistles were on their way. I was anxious to return to Cape Town, and as I had accepted a charter from Da Costa for cargo consigned to freighter and Elliot, the ship was soon loaded and ready to up anchor. I hardly remember the trip. My mind was so filled with Lourenço Marques and the possibilities of an Ethiopian empire. When we reached Table Bay, I left the ship, not to go aboard for many weeks. Captain Peter Benjamin was a perfectly reliable man, fully capable of handling all trading operations. I left the boat in his hands. At Cape Town, my attention was for a short time diverted into another channel. Haji Hassan's grapevine intelligence system, of which Hamid Abdurrahman was one tendril, reached even into the prison camp on the breakwater. Thus Hamid had learned that Kid Gardiner was in new trouble. He came to me for help, and together we plotted and planned how we might help our old friend, the Kid. The class distinctions and stratifications when I was in Cape Town were so numerous as to be utterly bewildering. The British, Hollanders, Portuguese, Spanish, Americans, and Bears were considered Caucasian, although there was plenty of dark blood admixed with most of them. The Africanados, Malays, Cape-colored bustards, and Swartz were considered Ethiopian, although much European blood ran in their veins. Race distinction was by rule, and out of this arbitrary ruling, the oppression necessary to maintain such a structure. The kid, because he was an American and fairly light-colored, had been quartered in a big open enclosure, together with several European prisoners. These men were highly insulted and awaited their chance to taunt the kid. The prisoners cooked their meals in big iron kettles over an open fire. One day at mealtime, a big greasy bear threw a slighting remark at the kid and his race. The Texan, true to form, grabbed the kettle from the fire and hit the bear over the head. There were 2 points on which the kid was touchy. One was his personal honor, the other the honor of his race. He had been put into solitary confinement by the prison officials, and Hamid wanted me to do what I could. I had only one avenue of hope. It seemed to me that Lord Milner, if approached directly, might start an investigation of prison conditions and secure legislation against some of the worst evils on the breakwater. Incidentally, he might be able to help Kid Gardiner. I realized, however, that the circumstantial evidence was all against the kid. He and I were both fighting for race equality, but his demonstrations were of such a violent nature that it was little wonder the officials suspected the idealism of his motives. I took the question to Lord Milner. He heard me through and promised to do whatever he could. I doubt if it was worth the effort, however. Shortly afterward, Hamid brought me word that the kid was out of solitary confinement, but that, no doubt, was in the ordinary course of events, and not due to anything I had done or said. Perhaps a year later, the whole prison system was given a severe shake-up, but I have reason to believe that Lord Milner had only a small part in that reform. The only certain result of the whole affair was to make the English more than ever my enemies. Any one who turns a hand to help a colored man in South Africa is suspected of sympathizing with the so-called Ethiopian movement. Certainly the officials distrusted me, and I have been told that some years later, in London, Sir Harry Johnson spoke of me as the most dangerous Negro in the world and a menace to the peaceful subjugation of the natives in Africa, but that was after I had gone to visit Segou Faku, king of the Pondos. There is no doubt in my mind that the English had wind of the proposed sale of Portuguese East Africa, for I was being watched at every turn, but strange to say, it was an Englishman who gave me just the information I was seeking in regard to that purchase. It was all quite by accident, however, and unintentional on his part. There was in Cape Town at this time a very fashionable resort in which the elite came to take the baths. Something about the water was supposed to cure them of all their ailments, and like the magical fount of Ponce de Leon, bring youth to those who drank and bathed. Here I had seen or met, in a casual and informal way, most of the notables of Cape Town. One of the most frequent visitors was a portly, bull-necked, ordinary-looking Englishman, whom I finally discovered to be Cecil Rhodes. Not only government officials, but also officers of the Army and Navy gathered here. Shortly after my return from Delagoa Bay, while my head was still filled with the prospect of buying the colony, the moment I received sufficient backing, and while I was still pondering why the Portuguese should be anxious to sell at such a ridiculously low figure, the whole matter was explained to me, almost as miraculously as if the stars had spoken. One day I had gone to the bath, and having bathed, was sitting in the luxurious lounge. Other frequenters were scattered here and there throughout the great room, talking and smoking. As I sat by myself, deep in thought, I was approached by a man who by his dress proclaimed himself an officer in the English army. We were soon conversing on this subject, and that including everything from bullfighting to poetry. On almost everything we disagreed, and when our conversation took the inevitable turn to the Boer War, I felt sufficiently argumentative to pretend I was pro-Boer. I have never been sure whether he was a man planted for the purpose of leading me into a confession concerning Lourenço Marques, or merely a man made indiscreet by anger. Perhaps he had been drinking, but whatever it was that loosened his tongue, I am sure that the information he gave me would have constituted evidence for his court-martial. I argued that the Boers knew the country in a way that the English would never know it. They knew each kopje and ravine, each drift in stream and river. I tried to show how a mere handful of Boers could harass a whole British regiment. You English don't know anything about guerrilla warfare than you did 150 years ago, fighting the French and the Indians, I taunted. You're too bull-headed to learn. Naturally, the officer was angered. What do you know about war? He asked, his voice low and tense. We will have Paul Kruger on his knees within 3 months. Just how? I asked. Then it was that he outlined a plan, never carried into effect, and long since carefully forgotten. It was a plan to flank the Boers via Delagoa Bay. 5 or 6 men of war and transports were to speed to Lourenço Marques and land an army. These English regiments were to march right across the neutral Portuguese territory, and while the army in Cape Colony kept the Boers occupied from the southward, this detachment was to fall upon them from the rear and cut them to pieces before they could fully realize what was happening. In its violation of neutral territory, it would have been not unlike the plan pursued by the Germans during the late war. The crystal cleared, and I could see the motives of men and of nations more clearly than as if they had been before me on the printed page. I had, through no virtue of my own, discovered at its inception such a maze of plotting and scheming as a historian may unravel only after years of unprejudiced study, and perhaps not then, for who knows what black secrets lie hidden in the archives of nations. I could now decipher words that formerly had no meaning. The reason why Lourenço Marques was chill with fear was obvious. They either knew or suspected that the English were preparing to make some such move, and they were bending all their efforts toward selling Lourenco Marcus before it could happen. They also must have realized that if the bears learned of the plans of the English, they would send an army to prevent the English from landing. In all events, the Portuguese knew that they stood in danger of foreign invasion. It was clear why I was being watched by the English. While there was some danger attached to marching through Portuguese territory, it was nothing to the danger of marching across the same country if it belonged to an American citizen. The Portuguese had realized that the title to their territory was not worth a fraction of the total value of their private property, and they had offered me their country not because they wished to lose it, but because they wished to keep it. I realized as thoroughly as anyone else how safe the land would be if I could make the purchase, and this new information, rather than discouraging me, urged me to even greater efforts. I sent more letters and planned day and night how I might secure the backing I needed. I would gladly have sold everything I owned, even my beloved ship, if it would have brought even a quarter of the necessary funds. It was useless to think of it. I knew that I needed help, and hoped against hope that some one of those to whom I had written would be moved by the same high fire that had moved me, and seeing the great possibilities of the future would give me backing. As the weeks passed, answers to my letters began to straggle in. Each that I opened brought disappointment. There were men among those to whom I had written who could have forwarded the whole sum, yet not one offered so much as a penny. They had forgotten their motherland as completely as if their forebears had not spent their lives in her jungles. To one hope I clung with tenacity. If all else failed me, I could at least depend upon Captain Forbes, but I hesitated to ask him for help. He had given me more than he could afford already, and I realized that while he would willingly procure me the sum I needed, he would have to impoverish himself to do it. In my extremity, however, I was almost prepared to ask him to make the sacrifice. Who can foretell the ironies of fate? On the very day I determined to write to him, unfolding everything, word came from England of his death. This loss, together with my continual disappointments from other quarters, went far toward disheartening me, and I began to despair of ever acquiring for my race the territory of Portuguese East Africa. Thus the bright bubble burst, and the greatest chance the Negro has ever had to rehabilitate Africa came to nothing. Every prominent Ethiopian in America had been approached. Without exception, they tried to dissuade me. They did not realize that before their eyes, within the reach of their hands, was a possibility to return to their own motherland, to return to the only environment in the world that fits the needs of the colored man, body, mind, and soul. They did not realize that for the first time in thousands of years, Africa had a chance of arising to her old glory. Why did you not respond, men of my race? You did not respond because you were born in a land where the Caucasian is in power and the Ethiopian can only imitate. You did not respond because of the centuries during which you have labored under the hypnotic influence of false ideals, false logic, false education, and false code of morals. You did not respond because the spirit had been beaten and whipped from your black bodies until you could no longer hold up your heads. Did you not realize that a race cannot be freed by others but must free itself? In your blindness and rustic unsophistication, you reminded me of the native Somali, who, if you were to offer him 1,000 bright gold sovereigns for a quart of goat's milk, would refuse, but if you were to offer him 3 cents worth of shell money, would gladly sell it.